and welcome to the Scotichronicast, the podcast which discusses all things relating to medieval Scotland. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Buchanan. This is a very special episode. It is the first episode, which is perhaps the most special of them all. I am honored to be joined today by Dr. Lucy Dean. Welcome to the podcast, Lucy.
Hi, Kate. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me onto the Scotichronicast. I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm looking forward to chatting to you about medieval Scottish history.
Well, I'm excited to have you on the podcast. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
I'm Dr. Lucy Dean. I'm a lecturer at the Centre for History for the University of the Highlands and Islands, based in and around the Highlands and Islands.
Yeah. So tell me, Lucy, where did you get started on your journey to studying medieval Scotland?
Yeah, it was quite an interesting diversion from quite a modern, an early modern area of study that I undertook for my undergraduate and my master's. But the thing that's always interested me has been rituals and representations of authority. So these themes kind of run through the work that I've done, and led me to Scotland as being a really fascinating landscape to explore this as a subject, and a theme that runs through society as a whole, but also I was particularly interested in the monarchy in Scotland and how it developed and how it might have developed differently to other places, and how its ritual might demonstrate to us some of the things that perhaps just a standard political study might not.
Oh, great. So what sort of country did you study for your master's?
I studied France for my master's. I looked at the court of Louis XIV, and I looked at both the way that he used material culture and visual imagery to project an image of authority, and then how other dissenters, different people within his country and beyond, used that same image to criticize him.
Oh, that's really interesting. So what brought you from France to Scotland, as it were?
Well, it was, I wasn't terrifically confident in my skills in early modern French, and I thought I'd push them to their limits.
I can understand that.
Yes, I thought I'd push them to their limits in the Masters. And so I thought that going somewhere with what I hoped would be a more English, Scots-based language would be sensible. However, I didn't really take into consideration the volume of Latin material in medieval Scotland, and indeed actually medieval French. So I actually shot myself in the foot in that regard. But I also was always interested in studying and researching Scotland. My father took us on many trips to Scotland as children, and we visited lots of castles, and it was all very exciting as a child to do that sort of thing. So there was always sort of a place in my desires of studying and researching history to go back to that sort of joyous period as a child. Right. And I'd sort of been diverted to doing French history at my master's because of the supervision available at the university that I was at. So I was, I really enjoyed doing it, and I find French history in that period fascinating. But there was something sort of a bit mysterious about Scottish history, because there's a lot of myth around a lot of Scottish history, and I also wanted to go back further in time, and I didn't feel comfortable trying to do that in a French context.
Yeah, that's sort of similar to me getting into medieval Scottish history, is that memories of childhood trips to Scotland and looking at the castles and the historic sites, and kind of wanting to return to that little bit of nostalgia there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I don't know, there's something even beyond that, there's something really, I don't know, there's a really big draw for me to medieval Scottish history. There's also a lot of historiographical gaps. Whereas French history is, I remember going to the Institute of Historical Research to like a French history seminar when I was doing my master's, and there are a number of people studying the period that I was studying and not dissimilar topics. It was quite terrifying, really, that you were, whereas finding new lines of argument in Scottish history is exciting, and you can plunge new paths, I think, in a way that you maybe wouldn't have the same opportunities to do, because the history of Scotland, while well known in a mythological sense, there's so much of it that is hidden or not explored because of like being the junior sister to England. It's sort of, its history has taken longer to come to the fore, I think.
Yeah, and it definitely is a lot more exciting when you can find something new.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially, and you don't have to worry about somebody accidentally doing the exact same topic that you are doing. You just don't know that you're researching the same topic as much, which can be fairly terrifying for academics.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember there was a moment when I was writing my thesis where I read an article about the coronation of James VI that somehow I'd managed to overlook until the third year of my thesis writing, and was mildly terrified that somebody had looked at this coronation in that much detail and was making these points that I've made before. But I think that the building up of history is not just about saying new things; it's about taking a new direction with the material or with the way that you look at it. So a lot of the studies of coronation in Scotland before the work that I've done were looking at one specific ceremony fairly much in isolation, other than the very early inaugural ceremonies. But so it was sort of that drawing it together and putting it into a life cycle of ceremony that was really what I was fascinated by and what I wanted to try and achieve.
Yeah, no, your PhD research has been super interesting and very vibrant. The visuals that you were able to like conjure up of what medieval Scotland actually looked like and felt like has been amazing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So that was mostly your PhD research. What have you been researching now?
Okay, so the long process of changing a thesis into a book has been quite a dominant part of my research in the last few years, more years than I'd care to admit to, I think.
It takes some of us lifetimes, apparently. That's me. I'm the one that's taking a lifetime. You've completed yours.
Yeah, it's going through some revisions, but yeah, it's not so far off, hopefully now. But yeah, so the book process has been both painful and joyous, I think is a good way to describe it, because...
Well, congratulations on it almost being finished.
Thank you. Yes, hopefully coming late 2021. But the idea of the cycle of death and the royal succession, which is at the core of the book, which was about looking at the fact that we often think about kings being made kings, but the process starts with the death of the predecessor, and quite often the funeral and the coronation aren't really linked together. So the premise of the book is to look at ritual as a cycle, bit like the cycle of life, but that starts with death, rather than it starting with the king being made king. So that idea of the life cycle is probably something that I've drawn out of this as something that's really fascinating in all walks of life in the medieval period. The rituals that surround everyday rather than just monarchical death and birth and baptism is something I'm really interested in. But one of the things that came out of looking at the royals in particular, was the fact that so many of Scotland's medieval kings are young, like really young when they become kings. They're mostly children.
Okay. So I was going to ask how young is really young.
Yeah. So the research that I've done looks from 1214 to the book will look to 1543, but in my thesis I went all the way up to 1603. And the kings within that period, I mean, there's very few of them who are adults when they come to the throne. They range from under a year to early teens coming to the throne, other than a handful of individuals who come to the throne as adults.
Right.
So this really interested me in, what was it like to become not just a monarch, but also a man, like to grow up in that situation where you are the center of everything, and to be the king, you should be the sort of the epitome of manhood. But if you're 6 months old, how does that process take place for somebody in that situation? And I was really inspired. I think I've been inspired by so many of the people that I've worked with, including yourself.
Thanks.
In terms of sort of looking at the gendered angle of Scottish monarchs, I was really inspired by work being done by people like Amy Hayes and Rachel Delman, and also more recently Katie Jack and Morven French, about the women's experience of Scotland in this time, and the focus on what life was like for those individuals. So not just looking at them as political actors where they occasionally appear as political actors, but what was their, what was it like to be a mother in that period? Right. What was it like to raise children?
That's something I've been thinking a lot of recently. Becoming a mother myself recently, I've been thinking a lot of like, wow, what must it have been like during, medieval times and stuff. It's, how did they cope with this part?
Yes, exactly. So that was it. That made me think about the fact that while history is often talked about as being the history of great men, and arguably Scotland's history is predominantly, I wouldn't like to say predominantly, but in some ways it is predominantly still the history of great men. It's done in really interesting ways by a lot of people, and there's a lot of history from below being done in Scottish history as well, but it's taken longer to take hold, I think, because the history, like we were saying earlier, the history of Scotland as an independent kingdom, it took so long to get started in an academic sense, that the history of gender is something that happened a little bit later in Scotland than it did in English or European history. And again, the looking at Scottish history through masculinity is something that's fairly new. I mean, the study of masculinity came out of women's history and gender history more broadly. And there's some really interesting work being done, like Elizabeth Ewan's being a pioneer in sort of supporting younger scholars who are working in this area. But it's still taking baby steps, relatively speaking, in comparison to what's being done for the modern period on masculinity in Scotland, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's the journey to getting to some of these points for Scotland is an interesting one to look at in and of itself. And just looking at how these things have materialized and how Scotland differed from its major European counterparts. So how it was different from England and from France. Since you have done a bit of study of French history, have you been doing a lot of connections or comparisons between Scotland's development in this to France, or is that just kind of incidental?
In terms of the research on ceremonies of death and succession, I did a lot of comparing what was happening in Scotland to sort of the key neighbours which Scotland interacted with at a diplomatic level the most during the period that I was looking at. There are some connections that I wish I'd had more time to look into, that perhaps more loosely based on trade. But the key sort of places that I tended to weigh my comparisons were with Scandinavian countries, because there's marriages between Scotland and Scandinavia dotted throughout the period that I look at. Right. France, because they're a key ally of Scotland during the majority of the period that I'm looking at. England, because you can't not really, being the southern neighbour, and also because everybody tends to make that comparison. I think that it has to be one that you draw in, even if it's to argue that there wasn't perhaps as many similarities as people would like to think between the two. And the Low Countries, so Flanders, is a region that is really fascinating in terms of the cultural impact on Scotland during this period, I think, as much as France or England. And there's been some really interesting work done by the Scotland and Flemish People project at St Andrews on sort of the interwoven ways that Scotland and Flanders were, and the rest of the Low Countries were interacting during this period.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how well Scotland was actually connected across Europe. People who don't know much about medieval Scotland seem to think that it's just this like mini England that's only interacting with England and usually in war, which, to be fair, it was interacting with England a lot via war.
Yes.
But yeah, the connections with so many other countries, and not just Ireland, because a lot of people assume that, oh, well, if Scotland was connected to any other country, it must have been Ireland.
Definitely the early period, that's something I looked at quite a lot as well, in terms of the initial influences that might have influenced Scottish ceremony. But what you were saying about the connections that Scotland has, it's something I spend so much time discussing with my students, because they, like you say, there's a sort of a preconception that Scotland's world was quite small, in that it didn't look out terrifically far. And one of the modules that I have been teaching while I've been at the Centre for History has been about Scotland, the North Sea and the Baltic region. So this was a course written by somebody else, but that I've really enjoyed taking on and leading while I've been there. And it is basically about that. It's looking at the types of links, so cultural, military, diplomatic, trade links that exist, and then also the key places where Scots were ending up and forming their own communities across Europe during the late medieval and early modern period. So looking as far as sort of Russia and Poland, Lithuania, where there was huge volumes of Scots in the 15th and 16th centuries, 16th and 17th centuries, and Scandinavia, and all these places where the relationships are looser in a diplomatic sort of royal sense in many ways, because there aren't, other than Scandinavia, there aren't marriage ties or specific treaties necessarily with these countries, but there is fascinating in sort of exchange of values, views, cultures. You cannot have trade going in directions that far without there being some kind of cultural crossover, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah. Wow, That's fascinating. That sounds like an amazing course.
Yeah, it's been really fun. The staff that put it together were really interested in the idea of Scottish diaspora and the idea of the Scots elsewhere, and they were thinking, well, how far, where does that go back to? Where was it that Scots started going first? And there's been a lot of focus on the Scots that go to North America, and the Scots that go to to Australasia, and yet that's a much more modern migration of Scots, whereas there's a keen interest in a lot of the staff at the Centre for History in sort of that earlier period and where Scots went east rather than west.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Cool. I didn't realize that there were Scots going into Russia, so that's really cool.
There's much smaller numbers that go as far as Russia, but there's some fairly prominent examples of Scots who end up serving in the Russian military during the 17th century. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. Students often find the military connections the most interesting ones, I think. But I think I'm probably more intrigued about sort of the cultural connections that they make and how that might be brought back to Scotland and how that might be.
Yeah, exactly. What the sort of like, what they brought back from their travels, because everybody knows that has traveled anywhere that you can't go to a foreign country without bringing back some sort of knowledge or new food that you like, or
exactly.
So that's fascinating. Cool. So your new work on masculinity, is that something you're working into an article or a book, or is it a course you're working on?
It's a bit of all three, actually. I while still working on the book project, I was working on a case study for James V. So James V reigns Scotland from the death of his father at Flodden in 1513 until he dies in 1542. And he's only 30 when he dies. And he's king from under 2 years old.
I was going to say another one of these young starters.
Yes, definitely a young starter. And at the time, he was the first Scottish king to be made king sort of prior to being able to walk and talk. I suspect he probably could toddle about by the time he was made king, but he definitely wasn't doing much of his own oath giving or anything in his ceremonies when he was young. And even more so than those from the 15th century who become kings when they're sort of between the ages of 6 and 15. He was really fascinating to me as someone who grew up entirely as king.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And when I was looking at comparisons and thinking about other kings that had grown up as kings, I was led to the work of Catherine Lewis, who works on medieval masculinity and particularly with religious men, but she's also done a study of Henry V and Henry VI, looking at masculinity in England during the 15th century. And she's taking a comparison of a very would be atypical manly king in Henry V and a king who is not so manly in Henry VI, and trying to look at the fact that actually where king's masculinity has been considered prior to this in English history, it does tend to be around where there are flaws and where there isn't, where there is a question about their sexuality perhaps, or there is a question about their relationships with their wife, their ability to produce children, these sorts of things. It tends to be tied to where men are seen to be being bad men or not achieving an ideal. But her work, she's sort of arguing that how can we say what's not an ideal if we don't try and understand what the ideal is, and that was really interesting to me, thinking about Henry VI started his reign at a similar age to James V, but James V ends up being relatively successful at being a man in comparison to Henry VI. And I was just interested at the sort of the different directions that went in, and it couldn't just be blamed on them becoming king at a very young age, or an age where they were badly influenced by other people. So there was a lot more to it than that. But also I was really interested in what was the Scottish ideal. At what age would James have been viewed as a man had he have not been the king? And how did he navigate around that? What built into that ideal? Was it about age? Was it about status? Was it about marriage? Was it about sexual activity? Was it about prowess in war? Or were there other things that I hadn't even considered, which is obviously very possible. So the case study sort of made me think this would be a really interesting way to compare Scottish kings, being that quite a lot of them become king when they are young, but they all have quite different reputations.
Yes.
So whether this would be an interesting way to think about their reputations through a different lens. So that's the really big project that may never happen, but that's the goal. I think it would probably focus on the later Stuarts, just for realistic possibility of it actually happening.
Yes.
But I also think that two kings that'd be really interesting to look at for different reasons linked to age and masculinity would be Robert II and Robert III. So the kings that come after the Bruces at the end of the 14th century, because they both come to the throne in their 50s, which is in most...
considerably late compared to all the rest of them.
Considerably late, yeah. And they're also, when you look at sort of advice literature and poetry and that sort of thing around, definitely in the 15th and 16th century anyway, they are past the peak of manhood, both of them, when they become king. And I thought it'd be an interesting way to talk about the political narrative that exists around these kings if you put it into a gendered context. So that might be another nice article length piece, maybe. So
fascinating.
And I have been, for the first time this semester, and hopefully the students enjoyed it. I haven't yet read their feedback sheets, but fingers crossed. I ran a fourth year module on reaching the estate of manhood in late medieval and early modern Europe. So looking at the different parts of the ideal. So we looked at things like reaching a certain age, the issues around status, issues around marriage and sexuality, sort of the idea of honour and valour, and being a military man, and whether honour is actually, it has to be connected with military virtue, or whether there could be another layer of aspects to what honour means.
Interesting.
And then we looked at sort of the slightly more complicated bits that don't naturally fall into what we see as a medieval and early modern ideal, like holy masculinity and homosexuality, and sort of mental health problems, and how these things might affect manhood in a period where they weren't necessarily understood in the same way that we understand them now. So
that's very interesting.
It really opened my eyes to how much reading I'm going to have to do. I've really enjoyed it. I have a love. I think it's something, if any students out there are listening, I think that it's something to bear in mind, that when you're doing sort of upper level modules, wherever you are in the world, those will be sort of core research of the person that is running that module, and that in designing them, I was advised by my colleague Dr. Elizabeth Ritchie when I started, and I was thinking about what I should write my modules about, and she said, you either need to know the material inside out, it's something that you've done for years, or you want to do it on something that you really want to know about because you're moving into that area of research. and the opportunities that I got through designing this module to read around the subject that I am focusing on now was a joy, because otherwise you just, as an academic, you really struggle to find the time to read everything that you need to read to go into a new subject area. So it's not like taking the module with the students is how I would put it, in that I have designed it and led them through it, but it's been a learning process for me as much as it has been for them. And then hearing their opinions and their views about that is really fascinating, because you get a spectrum of views. It's not just one person's views, it's not one historian's views, and by fourth year they're ready to argue occasionally with the historians and the sources. So it's really a fascinating process.
Yeah, that must be super exhilarating almost as a researcher, to have that the kind of ability to have those discussions around the topic that you're just starting to get into. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening. But I mean, the modules that other modules that I've written sort of some core skills modules, which are important, but they don't have the same joy sometimes in them. And I've also written a module on material culture in early modern, medieval and early modern Europe, and that was fascinating as well. And that was something that was somewhere in the crossover between knowing it really well and wanting to know more about it, because it's something that's central in what I do and what I'm interested in. But it was something that I knew there was a lot of interesting theory about that came from other disciplines that I hadn't maybe had as much opportunity to engage with as I would have liked. So it was, in piecing together some parts of that, it was really helpful for me in terms of methods, and being able to spend more time assessing different methods that people use in discussions with the students, because each set of students, I've taught that module 3 times now, and each set of students has a completely different idea about which of the methods that we discuss they feel would be the most fruitful. So the first time you teach it, you get sort of, oh, well, maybe I should be looking more at this kind of and then the next bunch of students think that actually that would be counterintuitive for them because of the background that they bring to the course. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting and cool to see, how different people think about the topics and how they approach looking at studying history. And yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah, I think it's something that I think I don't want to blow the trumpet of my department over the top, but the Centre of History at the University of the Highlands and Islands really is very open and focused on how to create a dialogue with the students about learning. And I don't know whether they recognise it or not at some level. Definitely by the 3rd and 4th year, I think they really do. And it's something that I think is really important, and that history is a constant dialogue. And we talk about that all the time, but that students realise that they're part of that dialogue. And I like to emphasise that with them, that, the dialogue, you are part of this dialogue if you take these modules with me. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of teaching at this level, but also an opportunity. And I think if we accept that our research grows through all of these different means, it's healthy. It's healthy.
Well, definitely.
And it also allows you interesting opportunities, like you say, to have dialogues beyond academic conferences, which are obviously brilliant for gaining new ideas in research, but there's a different kind of voice coming through in the discussions that you have with a class of students.
Exactly. Well, I think that's important, both for the students to realize that they're part of the dialogue, but for the instructors too, to realize the contribution that students are making, and to really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a great program there.
It was very exciting. It was very exciting to run the masculinity module for the first time, and I'm looking forward to running it again in the next academic year. So fingers crossed it goes as well the second time round as I think it seems to have gone the first time round, despite coronavirus and all the chaos that's happened this year. It's been students have been incredibly dedicated.
It's yes, it has certainly been an interesting year. Well, I hope that the next course does run well, and I hope your feedback ends up being good when you do get a chance to read it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy, for chatting with me today. This has been wonderful to talk about your research, what you have done, and what you're going to do in the future and working on currently. This has been really nice to chat about all of this. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and hopefully you'll have me back again.
I definitely plan on it. Definitely plan on it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us today on the Scotichronicast. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Our music has been Ex te lux orator by Gaita. Thank you for listening.